nutshell, it's fundamentally all the information on children is based on sexual abuse of 317 infants and children from 2 months of age to 14 years of age, the majority of them, in fact, under 10 years old.
Yeah, but you can't prove that, Dr. Reisman. And those who preside at the Kinsey Institute today are appalled at the, some might say, libelous charges that you make, not only about the work done by the late Dr. Kinsey, but also by some who follow him. We should also tell you that Indiana University, a very proud conservative institution of higher learning in America, stands by this institute, and most of the people who survive today, who worked with Dr. Kinsey, identify him as an honorable man who abused nobody, touched nobody, and not surprisingly, was a subject of controversy on the occasion of the publication of his book about men in 1948 and women in 1953. You can't prove that he abused children.
I think that the book establishes that there was abuse that took place without any question, and he admitted that, excuse me, he admitted that in the book. And if, in fact, it wasn't true...
What did he say that admitted that?
Oh, boy, do I wish... He said, he described 9 technically trained men. He called them technically trained men who he said were sexually stimulated. He said they had had sexual relationships with young boys and that they were the source of all of his data.
Right.
He described screaming and fainting and convulsions. He described children who were striking what he called the partner. That was the man,
right,
who was abusing the children. And then he drew from that conclusion himself, Phil.
Yeah, he
drew from that conclusion himself that the children enjoyed the experience. That's blaming the victim. You know what that is.
This audience, you are entitled to have me identify my own bias here right at the beginning.
Okay.
I admire what the Kinsey Institute does.
I know.
I am personally familiar with its director and have worked with her, and she has made a very important contribution to a series that I was proud to have my name on in 1986. So, you were on the Meese Commission on Pornography.
No. Sorry, Phil. That is as accurate as their information is. I was not on the Meese Commission on Pornography. And if their research is as accurate as that, then you have some idea of where I'm coming from and the fact that we can prove what we have to say.
I wrote a book on the Meese Commission, Phil.
Philip Noble, you're a writer for the Village Voice and you're a former Penthouse editor. Let me stand back from you. What accounts for my rare error here in suggesting that she was a member of the Meese Commission?
Judith Reisman testified before the Meese Commission, but like everybody else who has heard and evaluated her work, it was rejected. The Meese Commission refused to cite Judith Reisman in its report.
As wrong as what you just said. It's cited in the report. I mean, you know, people say things without any validity.
Let me ask you more specifically.
We don't have validity.
Dr. Reisman, do you think homosexuality is an aberration?
I think that bisexuality is an aberration, and I think that what do you mean by an aberration?
Abnormal.
Are you saying?
Can I ask you a question?
Well, I'd like to try and just
all right.
Tell me your feeling about the.
My feeling about homosexuality has very little to do with what I've got to say about children, although they attempt to shift it over there. Let's get back to what we're talking about, what I'm talking about. Wait a minute, Phil. I've been a child advocate all my life. And we are talking about children, and we are talking about what was done to these children. The homosexuality issue is another issue which I'd be delighted to get to as we move along.
Right,
but
I do think it's important at least to establish. The suggestion is that you do have a bias, Dr. Reisman.
A bias? How do you mean a bias?
That you think homosexuality is somehow subnormal.
I'm saying that homosexuality does not appear to be, as far as I know, by any means as healthfully productive for human beings as heterosexual experiences, which involve 2 human beings. And by the way, what do you mean by homosexuality? Are you talking about male homosexuality, or are you talking about female homosexuality? Because we're talking here about 2 different kinds of things.
So it's an unhealthy psychosexual state, then.
It is look, it's not. I'm not the expert on homosexuality.
But you bespeak a bias about it, and you are presiding over a book that embarrasses the kids.
Yes, but Phil, why are you looking at the homosexual stuff? Just a minute. Why not address what? Why not address what the real issue is? The real issue is that we are saying that the Kinsey Institute was involved in the actual, that Kinsey was involved in the actual use of 9 sexual offenders, rapists, child rapists, who abused children.
Kinsey interviewed people in prison.
He interviewed people, but those weren't. But those were not the men who did those things to those children. You're talking about 800. You're talking about one man that they said abused 800 kids. Come on, this is not. It's like going to a rapist and asking the rapist, how did the rape victim enjoy the rape?
It's like going to a rapist and interviewing him for the important work of determining what kind of profile is guilty of this kind of horrendous behavior so that we might avoid it in the future.
Not what he did.
Edward Eichel wants to say what, sir? You're a sex researcher and you're co-author of this book, Kinsey, Sex and Fraud. You feel that today's sex research has a gay bias. Is that so?
Well, I think you're sort of jumping on Judith for my part of the book. And I'd have to pose a different kind of question. Do you think heterosexuality is abnormal? For instance, is it just the inhibition of society that causes people to be exclusively heterosexual? And I am saying...
People are not exclusively heterosexual. We have a global
I'm saying that
population of people who are
a great majority of the population is, although Kinsey's data led people to believe otherwise, and that there is nothing wrong with heterosexuality, even though Dr. Reinisch of the Kinsey Institute's mentor, Dr. John Money, has termed obligative heterosexuality a term to suggest that heterosexuals are pathologic. She considers him a mentor.
Right. Ed.
That is June Reinisch's mentor, according to her in her book, The New Kinsey Report.
Poor Dr. Kinsey. Here we are, 50 years later, arguing about this guy. What did you want to say?
I wanted to say that Kinsey, Sex and Fraud, as Mary McCarthy said of Lillian Hellman's work, is a lie. Every word in this book is a lie, even the thes and the ands.
Yes.
In fact, Judith Reisman has spent 12 years investigating Kinsey, trying to show that he molested children. I read her book. I wrote an article about it. You know who her sources are, Phil? Kinsey himself and his biographer, Wardell Pomeroy. In 12 years of investigation, she's found only 2 people who support her contention, and they turned out to be Kinsey himself. Why? Because he admitted he did take evidence from men who had sex with boys. That is no crime, and she smears Kinsey with that.
Guess who's here? C.A. Tripp, Ph.D. Well, all you did was work with Dr. Kinsey. Do I understand that?
Yes, for many years.
You knew the man personally?
Yes.
Did you call him Al?
No, I called him Proc, as most of his friends did, short for Professor Kinsey.
We should say that you are the author of The Homosexual Matrix, a book which got quite a positive response from...
I want to agree with Reisman on one point. I think we really ought to talk about the child stuff before we mix in the
well, make your point,
homosexual stuff. You know, we really shouldn't go too fast there. We want to savor that because it is wonderful. It's so delicious what she says, because she says that Kinsey molested these children.
No, I didn't.
And
no, I didn't.
Take a look. I want to draw you a picture of the image. The image is that the world-famous sex researchers, or Dr. Kinsey alone, it's not quite clear, are in a room, and they hover over a young child, less than a year old, and with their fingers or a feather, that's not quite clear, they tickle the genitalia and bring this kid to orgasm, who is screaming and hollering and possibly held down by chains.
And drugged.
It's all too glorious.
Well, make your point. I hope that you don't. You're being sarcastic, but I want to make sure.
I didn't mean to be sarcastic.
You're saying this isn't true, that Dr. Kinsey or his colleagues did not.
If he had done any of that, I would be the first to know, because I did the photography in those days.
Didn't Dallenbach do photography?
Not till later.
Oh.
Dallenbach was my partner.
Right.
And I did the photography. I was called in on that. I was called in specifically on the items that she mentioned.
Excuse me, did you do the photography on the sadist and the masochist that were at Indiana University, where they were dropping the hot wax on the body parts?
Let's stay with your favorite.
You did that? You did that? Okay, thank you, Dr.
Grimm. You notice here the attempt to divert, because that's extremely embarrassing situation to be held responsible for what you said in print.
Right. May I ask you to sum up your grievances, please, as a former personal and professional colleague of Dr. Kinsey? What is going on here?
Not a single thing. Neither Kinsey nor his staff members ever had any erotic contact or any masturbatory contact with any subject whatsoever from start to finish.
Yes. And how do you explain that this woman would step forward, PhD and all, and 50 years after the facts, write a book published by a small Louisiana publishing house, which does not make it wrong, Kinsey, Sex, and Fraud. What's going on here? Let me just put it more specifically. Not a few folks see this as another attempt by the religious fundamental right to discredit the man who tried to suggest to us, among other things, what is now accepted, I think, by mainstream America of all religious and political persuasions, and that is that sexuality is an entitlement, that it is perfectly natural, that the onset of eroticism as it happens in adolescent males and females is important to understand and welcome and receive without judgment and don'ts and naughties and finger shaking. And in that sense, he made a tremendous contribution.
One of her complaints is that he started the sexual revolution, which has dissolved our morality. Do I speak
Now, look,
correctly?
did I just watch your program the other day when we were reading about, or when we were seeing about date rape and what's happening on our campuses?
And you see Kinsey, do you here?
Will you tell me where's one table in Kinsey's books, though he had 1,400 sex offenders, where's one table that shows anybody who was raped in 1940 and raped in 1953? No, we have no rape. We have rapists, but we have no rape.
Yeah.
We have children screaming and crying and having convulsions. Phil, let me ask you, would you say that when you read about children striking a partner to get away, would you say that that sounds like someone who cares about those children? And would you say that we're going to care and we're going to say and by the way, I just found out that you're the guy that did that photography. It wasn't in the book. It wasn't anywhere. Now we know who did it.
I love that part.
All right, we'll stay with the children.
Does anybody have a question?
Phil, you have some tables, don't you? You have some tables that show 24 hours around the clock.
This is part of the smear. Judith Reisman has found nothing that every scholar who read the Kinsey reports for the last 50 years hasn't read.
It
is because of her it is because of her mind. It is because of her mindset.
Could we see the tables?
Penthouse Forum. He writes about positive incest. Anybody, as far as I'm concerned, who's writing about positive incest and defending the Kinsey Institute, because the Kinsey Institute won't come here to defend them, though they got me off radio, and they tried to get me off all kinds of other shows.
Yeah,
they sent him.
Richard E. Vatz, Ph.D. Kindly keep your answers a little shorter, if you will, please.
I'm here to represent the non-lurid interest group.
You are, among other things, Associate Psychology Editor for USA Today magazine.
Magazine, not the newspaper. It's an educational magazine, right? One of the interesting things here, although I cannot adjudicate the factual disputes between the two sides on this, is that I think the Kinsey Institute opens itself to these kinds of attacks because it makes such a strong claim to being scientific. The survey they just came out with, for example, claims to be a scientific measure of the basic sexual knowledge of the American people. Now, there are some questions on there that lend themselves to some kind of scientific verification, but a tremendous amount of what they do, and by the way, this criticism was also made in the 48 and 53 studies, but it's also made now. A tremendous amount of what they do is simply not scientific. It doesn't deal with biological processes. It deals with behavior.
So what?
Well,
I mean, you know, my sense is that we get into these arguments about semantics because we're made uncomfortable by the subject of the inquiry.
Well, but let's see if it is semantics. Let's see if there are consequences to the words we use. When you call something scientific, you are claiming that there's a certainty to it. There's also a claim that you should have a silence because people should bend to what science says.
I don't think that Kinsey ever claimed that we should be silent.
In fact,
but there's more than this has to do with this has to do with accusation of criminal behavior, which is not provable.
But I'm saying that to the extent to which, and again, this is sort of throughout the Kinsey Institute work, the extent to which they claim that their work is uniformly scientific is a claim that it is not open to reasonable criticism. Kinsey himself was very intolerant of any kinds of criticism. I think Dr. Reinisch is very close to...
I kind of see him as a blood brother
as a
in
matter
that
of fact,
sense myself.
His biographer, recommended by the Kinsey Institute book, indicated he's intolerant to criticism.
Are you there, caller? I'm glad you waited.
Yes.
Good.
I have two children in that age group that you're talking about, and I just want to know, why is it so important that we find out the sexuality of children at that age?
Because sexuality begins in utero.
That is what Calderon says. What do we mean? Everything begins in utero.
Well,
reproduction begins in utero, for crying out loud.
You don't want us to study that, then?
That's sexuality in utero?
Uh-huh.
Phil, I'd like...
Tell me you're laughing.
How are we going to study sexuality in utero?
Well, first of all, you can see the erection. That's what they tell me.
What do we mean by an erection? I've seen what they call an erection. That depends on your perception of what the devil is an erection.
Look closer.
I have questions. I don't see what the point she's trying to make is.
I want to see, buddy.
I understand that she's questioning the methodology, but I don't see the point.
Kinsey was to sexuality what Freud was to psychiatry, what Madame Curie was to radiation, what Einstein was to physics. Comes along this woman with a book saying, holy cow, E doesn't equal MC squared. We've based an entire generation of education of sexologists on Kinsey, and Kinsey was a dirty old man.
But she seems to be...
and he wasn't. He wasn't. The guy, first of all, the guy was married once. Nuclear family kind of guy.
But Ed
Comes
Eichel...
along his pal to say, hey, nobody ever touched anybody, nobody ever... And when he first came out with how long the erection is, how long the sperm for the ejaculation, people went nuts. And he talked about masturbation. It was 1953. Holy cow, I remember it. I was embarrassed.
Sperm, for crying out loud. Who collects sperm? From kids.
But do you disagree with...
kids.
Yeah.
Do you disagree with the results?
Kids don't have sperm. So
that's
let's
a very
get
good
that
question.
straight.
Kids don't have sperm. So what was he collecting? And how was he doing it? And what did he do with it once he got it?
Judith,
and
you
that
studied
was in
it.
Cordell Pomeroy's book.
Judy, you studied Kinsey for 12 years.
Why don't you care more about the children than you do about protecting the finances of the sex industry and the sex establishment?
Yes, Judith.
Right, the sex industry. Tell me about this sex industry.
May I answer her?
Is there, just tell me, is there any kind of sex research that you would approve of?
We have to learn about the way people feel and the way people are, Phil.
Right.
But we cannot separate sexuality out from the rest of what we are. If we study, like psychologists had attempted to do before, if we study who we are, sexuality is only a part of who we are. It's a part of our community. It's a part of the way we interact.
I think also,
when you isolate, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry.
You also believe that the gay population makes up only 2 or 3% of the human population.
The data that's coming out not only from England but from the National Opinion Research Council, which doesn't have any connection to the sex industry, and as I understand it is not being given any money by questionable individuals, has identified roughly 2%, I'm sorry, they identified less, they said about 1% of the population
1%?
is homosexual. That's not my fault. I'm not the people who do the research. And,
so you believe 1% of the human population is gay?
Do I believe it? It sounds reasonable. It doesn't sound unreasonable. Let me ask you this, Phil. Do you think that 10% is homosexual? And what do you mean, again, by gay? When you look at the way he defined homosexual, it's not the same as what it sounds like.
I think there's about 10% of the population that's gay. And also, I'd like to know where you're getting all your information from. You know,
Pardon? I didn't hear it. I'm sorry.
Well, the Kinsey's got a profile on you too,
So
Dr.
could I make a point here? Over and over again, the Kinsey Institute and people like Masters and Johnson claim to be disinterested scientists. And whether or not these statistics can again be finalized, it was perceived in 1948, and it's perceived now, that the writings are very antagonistic toward those who have prejudices against certain sexual behavior. that the writings are antagonistic toward those who believe that there should be conservatism in sexual behavior. Now, those may be good values, they may be bad values, but that is not the role of a disinterested observer or researcher. That's one of the problems.
Okay, guess who thinks this is a wonderful book?
Yes.
Patrick Buchanan.
Oh, well, but he's anti-Semitic, and I'm Jewish.
I didn't say this. Don't get me in another libel suit now. This is herein contained is a conservative political agenda, Dr. Reisman.
Political agenda for
which
children.
makes smears and accusations against the work of a man who is acknowledged to be a giant of 20th century science.
Bill, if that's true...
He took a lot of risks, no doubt about it.
Oh, yeah.
As everybody do. I'm talking about in terms of reputation, misunderstanding, and all. The 1940s?
Yes.
Nobody was talking about this.
That's right.
And he made an enormous contribution to the understanding of who we are.
What kind of a contribution? I repeat, if I'm wrong, if we're wrong, Phil, why don't they sue me? So sue us. Sue me. They threatened just, oh, yeah, sure. I'm on national television. I'm Phil Donahue. If they could win it, they'd do it.
And
what did Walter Stewart say? He also backed that up. And who's Walter Stewart? Read that.
He's a research scientist for the National Institutes of Health.
Yes, and he's been involved in fraud in science, and he is a highly reputable individual. He read this material and said this is critical material for everyone to read. I don't want anyone to believe us, Phil.
Yeah.
Not anyone. I want everyone to read it for themselves, go out and look in their libraries, check the Kinsey Institute
right. When
data,
can we
and
start?
then decide.
When can we begin to study sexuality, in your opinion?
What do you mean by we? Who?
The research community, the professional community. Is it a good idea to know who we are?
Community?
Is it a good idea to know who we are?
Psychiatrists, psychologists, yes, to investigate is part of the way in which they do things. Not to separate it out as if it was an atomistic piece.
In other words, don't measure erections and the time of the erection and all that stuff.
Are not removed from our brains, our hearts, our souls.
Right.
That's what's gotten us in the problems we're in the first place.
Right. You like that? You're tired of all this clinical stuff. And you don't want to know how old a man is and what's the normal response of a man who's 42? 48? 56?
No, he wants to relax and enjoy himself.
Oh, 48 you want to know. I'll tell you what, after the show, we got charts and graphs for you. You can take them home later and show them to your husband. We're with the people who have deeply disturbed those who preside over the Kinsey Institute today, and those who step forward to say, before you swallow this whole, we should know with whom we're speaking, and not a few people who support the Kinsey Institute have questioned your credentials.
Of course they do. I would if I had the investment they have.
Judith Reisman, Phil, happens to be the most repudiated PhD in America.
First
of all, Phil, sure, her work has been rejected by the Justice Department that ate their $800,000 grant.
So you're supporting Meese now.
Secondly,
this is a spokesman for Meese now, over
the American...
Meese.
Please, Judith. The American University also rejected her study.
Yeah.
The Meese Commission refused to cite it.
I don't think you've ever been published, have you, in a scientific journal?
Yes,
Never.
I certainly.
Name it.
Never.
Name it.
How about ethology and sociobiology? Is that scientific enough for you?
But did you not spend a good deal of time writing music for Captain Kangaroo?
Oh, my God.
But, you know, that doesn't make you a bad person, huh?
Oh,
No.
I wrote for Captain Kangaroo. I
And you
wrote for children for years. This is part of what I've been doing for years.
You know, Dr.
I've been
Reisman
concerned
can
about
answer
children for years,
Yes.
from music to professionalism.
And you're proud of it.
Anti-child.
And we'll be back in just a moment.
I just have a comment. I would like to know if this man from Penthouse would like to write a book on abstinence before marriage. I think that would solve a lot of problems in
Abstinence before
abstinence before marriage.
Actually, Judith Reisman's publisher, Huntington House, has done such a book. You should know the company she keeps. It's called A Reasonable, get this, Phil, A Reasonable Reason to Wait, a sexual guide for those who haven't been sexually involved, and healing for those who have. That's a book. That's a book we really need.
You know, Phil, I've got to tell you something. When I started this research on Kinsey, I was told there was no way I would get this thing published. There's no way the public would ever get to read what we had found out. Now, I want to tell you something.
What?
Only in America. You're supporting Kinsey. You folks have been involved.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Here we are, right? 3 cheers, because I got to tell you something. If a small publisher back in the back hills of Louisiana is willing to take that risk with the big boys, then we ought to give him an applause.
So the day may come when the only person interested in me will be a very small publisher, if any publisher at all. So I bring no prejudice there.
Phil, I just wonder why there's so much attention to the sexuality, the little erection of a fetus, when in fact the most advanced kind of research on male-female adult compatibility is being suppressed while pedophiles are put on program committees of the Society for the Scientific Study of Sex, and that happened
but that's, you're going beyond the arena of our discussion here, and I hope you don't mean to suggest that the Kinsey Institute is responsible for whatever your unproved allegation may be. Let's keep this at home here.
Could I ask the Kinsey people one question? Do you agree that a great deal of what passes for research in sex has a social agenda? Do you agree, for example, that when Masters and Johnson published a book called Crisis, in which they claim, and this is a quote, that AIDS is rampant in the heterosexual community, do you agree that that bespeaks a certain social agenda on the part of people who claim to be disinterested researchers?
What? Why?
Well, because...
Why? If you say that Tay-Sachs strikes Jews and other... other people who are born and raised in a certain global geographic area, does that bespeak a political agenda?
No, it doesn't, because in this case, with Masters and Johnson and the book Crisis, it has been disavowed by every serious scientific observer in the country, practically.
As is Judith's work. And hers will be withdrawn.
Are you there?
Does the Kinsey Institute disavow Masters and Johnson's work called Crisis?
Yes, everybody has.
Yeah.
Does the Kinsey Institute...
We got some men who want to ask a question, yeah.
I don't mean any disrespect to your panel here, but how come these so-called sex experts are always people who look like they never get it on?
Well...
No, I am.
Yeah.
Phil?
Well,
Phil,
how proud your parents must be of you.
Phil? Phil, when I was coming to this program this morning, I bought 4 copies of the Village Voice because there was an article about our book. And the man who sold the magazine said to me, when we discussed the fact about our sex research, he said, hey, you know, he said, my girlfriend always says, how can sex be good unless it's dirty? There's your Kinsey mentality.
Oh, boy, we ought to lock that kid in the basement.
In fact, Kinsey would say it's only good when it's dirty.
Yeah, Kinsey it's only good when it's dirty, says the representative here.
It happens to be an old Woody Allen joke.
Are you there, caller?
Yeah.
Are you there?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I have a comment. I'm thoroughly distressed at this rude behavior of this woman you have on this panel. I think it's very sad in this day and age. You have such obviously an enlightened group of other panelists on there, and they can't get a word in edgewise. Her physical body language, she's all over that poor man next to her, wagging her finger at everybody. How would you like to have a woman like this for a mother?
Shall I be quiet?
No, not at all. All right. This is big. You're for, right? I know. I hope you don't.
I would prefer to be quiet.
Yes, I hope you don't criticize Dr. Reisman for her enthusiasm. It's something we long for and try to promote on our own program. Doesn't do any good to talk if nobody's listening.
Phil, what she should be criticized, though, for is her McCarthyism. You know what the worst thing in her sexual McCarthyism, the worst thing in this book is not anything she says about Kinsey, who, after all, is dead and cannot be hurt. Right. She actually smears the former president of American University, Dr. Richard Berenson, a man who was caught up in child sexual abuse himself, and therefore...
telephone sexual abuse himself.
Yes, and when he went on Nightline, he explained why he was involved in that. He said he himself was abused by a relative in a cellar as a child. So what does Judith Reisman do to him?
Let's let him make his point.
She smears him in the book, saying that the study on the childhood images in Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler, the $800,000 study that was rejected by everybody in the world, she says that Richard Berenson was responsible for that subversion because he himself was a collector of pornography as was involved in child sexual abuse fantasies. How dare she smear a man who has begged for forgiveness and who has explained his own abuse like that? that. That's the kind of sympathy this woman shows.
Accurate with respect to
okay, I got to break you. You're not going to show dirty pictures, are you?
Well, you know, he's telling me about what's not
I mean,
there. You want to put it on the screen?
Probably not. I'm afraid to look myself.
Well, I mean, this is just innocent
come on.
stuff.
Huh?
This isn't
What's the
hardcore
point to be made with this material?
The point is that Playboy and... turn the page for the photographs. Those are just the cartoons.
Well, no,
this is from your rejected study, Judith.
It is not a rejected
What is the point?
study.
You did a study on cartoons in Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler.
No, sorry, there we go again.
Sure.
We did not do a study on cartoons.
What did
we
you
did
do?
a study on cartoons, cartoons,
images.
and images.
Visual images,
right.
I am
in Playboy,
corrected.
Penthouse, and
Yes.
I want to tell you something. Look at the opening letter. That was used by the Simi Valley authorities. That man right there, Dwayne Tinsley, the guy who did that cartoon in the top, was arrested for child sexual abuse. He'd been sexually abusing his own daughter for years. They used our research to identify that and to get the guy, in fact, convicted.
The Kinsey
now, the daughter
Institute
said that those pictures were actual pictures of what was done to her.
And why did the Justice Department
what we've
reject
got
your
here
study,
with this
Judith?
man here with Nobile, who speaks about positive incest all the time, okay, in Penthouse, is the defense of child sex abuse. I'm a problem because I will not defend child sex abuse. I never will, and they will support it.
I will be back in just a moment.
Be part of the audience. Please send a postcard to Donahue Tickets, care of NBC, 30 Rockefeller Plaza, New York, New York, 10112. Remember, postcards only, please.
Hi, I'm glad you waited. Go ahead.
Yes, Phil?
Yeah.
I'm a psychotherapist, and I used to respect the Kinsey reports, but to hear the doctor telling me how they got the data, has changed my opinion. I think it's perverse, and it should not be accepted in the name of science, and I resent the
You're a
panel.
psychotherapist?
Yes.
And whose work would you endorse on the issue of sexuality?
I don't know anymore. It changed. I used to...
Well, it's hard to imagine that as a practicing psychotherapist, you have no one that you would professionally embrace.
Masters and Johnsons.
You like Masters and Johnson? Well, they've been victimized in the same way Kinsey has.
I mean, and I don't like the Penthouse people being there. I mean...
You don't like the Penthouse people being here?
I'm not a Penthouse person.
Oh yeah? We got your number. Don't kid us.
Joni's in a lot of trouble. Where are the tables, Phil? Please.
What do you want the
Phil,
tables?
Put up the tables.
Now
Let the people see them.
This will make your point, will
Yes,
it?
you let the American public look at it, and let him
Judith,
pay attention to what
Judith,
those
after
tables
the tables, can we put up the lies in your resume?
are. Oh, a Penthouse man, go.
All right. See, this is a
Lies in
woman
your resume.
who could not...
Phil, I think the tables would be fair.
Let the
And her
American
resume.
public...
Judith, did you
let the American public
Let the public
see it.
think,
He
Phil.
runs from
Let
it
the
because
public-
he
let the
doesn't
public
want people
see
to
the
know.
material.
No, and I'd like
He
to see
doesn't
her
want
resume
anybody
as well.
to see it.
The tables show the number of orgasms in humans, males, I assume, 5 months to 4 years.
You've got 2 months old.
5 months
okay. You've got one child allegedly having a climax. Where are those tables? So you've got 24 hours around the clock, 26 orgasms
Around
in
the
a 4-year-old.
Wait a minute.
You want to tell me? You want to tell me where are those
right,
tables?
show 'em, Brian.
Where are the tables?
Yeah. Well, we're going to show.
There.
Now,
right, read
now, what is the point?
You
what is
tell
your
me
point?
what is the point. 5 months old. What is it? I can hardly read it. What's next to that? Number of orgasms. Oh, number of orgasms, 3. Go down to the 4-year-old. You see the 4-year-old there?
17, yeah.
There, bottom one.
Yes,
4-year-old, 26 orgasms in 24 hours. Tell me, Phil. Tell me, Phil. Does a baby sleep? Tell me, Phil. Tell me, Phil. Does a baby sleep? Tell me if this is scientific. A baby
Very
sleeps for
scientific.
8 hours?
And
You
you
tell
can't
me
get
how
the-
you get 26 orgasms
If
for 24
Judith,
hours.
I don't know, but,
We've got to
Just
be
a minute.
able to get a word in edgewise.
Just a minute,
Yeah.
just a minute.
Sounds like a guest for the Donahue show.
And you know what Gebhardt said to me? You know what Dr.
What'd he
Gebhardt
say?
he wrote me a letter, which I wish you had up there too, in which he said that oral and manual techniques were used on the children. Now, Phil, I'm going to say that once more. I'm going to say that once more. And if I'm wrong, let them sue me. He said oral and manual techniques were used on those children.
Yeah,
What American is going to defend that?
How does C.A. Tripp respond to that?
She's talking about data that came from pedophiles, that he would listen to only pedophiles who were very careful, used stopwatches, knew how to record their things, did careful surveys, and these she resents very much, but they're very important.
So he interviewed people who were known criminals, I assume. Were they in prison at the time?
Oh, certainly not, but they were, in her sense, criminals because they were pedophiles, but they were trained
Oh, in her
trained
sense,
observers.
they were criminals because they were pedophiles. They're
They were
raping
trained
children and they're not
observers.
criminals. You're going to defend
Nobody
that.
was raping children. What they were
What do you
doing...
call sexually, manually, and orally abusing a baby, and you're a bloody pedophile?
As for...
A bloody pervert!
You helped edit this book, is that so?
That's right.
And you are?
Dr. Gordon Muir.
Dr. Gordon, very good.
Try and bring some sanity into this program. Now, we have a guy here called Dr. Tripp.
Yes.
Who thinks that you can present valid data on sexual behavior, normal sexual behavior, by masturbating human infants for 24 hours at a time. Is that correct?
But
that's
yes,
what Kinsey
somebody in
claimed.
the audience,
That's what Kinsey claimed.
Yes, I'm not denying
and you're
that.
telling me that, Kinsey came across in an interview sample of 5,300 people, he found pedophiles who had stopwatches, just happened to have stopwatches, just happened to have all that data handy.
Hush up.
I'll give you a chance to respond to the gentleman's question in just a moment, if it please the court. I'm sorry, I must make this time out. I've got an audience here that wants in here, and I have an obligation, as do we all, to give them a chance. Sir.
Thank you. What was the point of the research if the Kinsey report did not follow up on the people they did research of when they were children?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure they did. Yeah.
I think it's a bit nuts to count anybody's orgasms, but how do we approach our children sexually, generally?
Where do we get information if we don't?
Not from sex offenders.
Yeah.
Just because one child had 5 orgasms, how's that reflecting everyone else? I mean, that was just one isolated event.
Besides, what do we call an orgasm?
Sir.
I'm just appalled at Dr. Tripp's whole attitude towards this whole thing. She's throwing accusations at him, and he's just standing there like it was funny or anything like that.
Well, I think it's absolutely hilarious. You talk about a man who's the champion sex researcher. He did very careful work. Everybody just asks irrelevant questions.
This country
has nothing to do with anything.
The gentleman on the end who writes for Penthouse, it disturbs me that you talk about positive incest. I don't understand that. That's very disturbing.
Listen, my daughter, Maeve, happened to be the star of an anti-child molestation film. I will not be smeared by this woman, Judith Reisman. I wrote an article based on data. She is afraid of ideas.
Are you there, caller?
Dangerous one.
Philip, there's no positive insight.
I got to press the button. Are you there, caller?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead, please.
You know, I really think that this is all about the age-old American fear of sexuality. And what makes it even worse is that if you really think about it and listen to what these people are saying, they're just afraid to admit that there is such a thing as childhood sexuality, that whenever you talk about childhood sexuality, people just freak out. And yet I'm a student of the history of sexuality, and I know there is such a thing. Children do respond to things.
I agree. Yeah.
I don't know much about the Kinsey report, but I'm definitely going to read up, and I'm not going to buy your book and make you rich.
Well, yeah.
I'd like to know why she has everything to say and the other people are just sitting there.
Well, because they got a lousy moderator who didn't equally distribute
One
the
quick
time.
rhetorical question. Where do they get these children from for these studies?
Yeah.
The children were all taken from...
I would just like to say, regardless of what
they were all taken
Judith
from
says and how she feels, they shouldn't keep down her credentials.
I didn't hear.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Years ago, our children were brought up under Siga, Dr. Mary Calderon. Yes. At that time, they were showing a film.